Hi, and welcome to this episode of the podcasts of the International Dialogue Initiative. The International Dialogue Initiative, or IDI, is a group of 20 experts from different disciplines and also diverse backgrounds who have been working together for more than 10 years to try to understand the political aspects and dimensions of different societal and political developments. My name is Bijan Khajehpour. I'm a member of IDI, and it's a pleasure to interview or have a conversation with another member of IDI, Dr. Coline Covington, who is an experienced psychotherapist and a corporate consultant focused on ethical behavior in corporations. Today's topic is the psychological dimensions of the return to work post-pandemic. We all have dealt with this coronavirus pandemic for the past 3 months. It has disrupted our lives, our work, our routines, but gradually we are returning to work and trying to find a new normal. But while everyone pays attention to the physical aspects of the return to work, from physical health to physical structures in the office, to observing laws and regulations, very few people are paying attention to the psychological aspects of the return to work. In fact, while we have been dealing with a virus pandemic over the past 3 months, we are expected to be dealing with a pandemic of anxiety. And this pandemic of anxiety will be a challenge to leaders, to stakeholders, to experts, professionals, and so on. So today's podcast will be about how to deal with the situation, what aspects to pay attention to. And it's a pleasure to have Coline in this conversation, who taught me a few months ago when this whole development started, that in the initial phases, we are usually in a managing mode. We manage, we cope with the situation. But the real challenges will start when we try to regain a new normal. And to understand where we stand, I would like Coline to start with sharing with us what the latest developments have been. What are you seeing in your work? What kind of anxieties, what kind of uncertainties that are putting pressure on businesses and individuals alike?
I think, as you very rightly said, and I referred to it originally about this managing mode that we're in, but we're just beginning to get out of the eye of the storm. And in the midst of the storm, all we can do is just hunker down and manage and just make sure we survive. But then when we cut out of the storm, it's like getting out of a hurricane where we're faced with the destructiveness around us. And we're also faced with the prospect of smaller storms happening. Maybe not smaller storms in some areas, we don't know. But the whole landscape will have changed and has changed. And the thing that I'm most aware of at this point, when I talk to my own patients, when I talk to colleagues, friends, is that beginning to come out of lockdown, and I think this is true with other countries as well, is a time that feels very precarious. It's raising not only, it's making us aware of how tired we are of being in isolation. There's a fatigue from anxiety and also from isolation that almost everyone is experiencing in some form. You know, some people may say they're just slightly sleepy. Other people may find that they sleep 10 hours a night. It's very prevalent. And in coming out of lockdown, I think this fatigue is hitting us along with terrible anxiety about leaving lockdown and the kind of world we're re-entering and the losses that we'll all be experiencing in some form or other. And in relation to that anxiety, and I think this applies also in terms of companies and corporations, what is key, and you can see this in different countries, is the quality and the clarity of our leadership. And the political leadership is enormously important in terms of making us either feel safe or as safe as we can be, or making us feel very unsafe. When you have a parent who isn't clear about what the rules are, for example, children don't feel safe. And certainly in the UK, that's being experienced to a large extent among the population. There's a lot of anger and a lot of insecurity about what the rules are, what's going to be safe, what isn't going to be safe. And other countries are have stronger leadership and feel safer. The population feels safer. They may not be safer, but they feel safer. And this is something I think that is a lesson to corporations and to companies, that leaders need to be very clear with their employees and their staff about what they expect, what the rules are, and what is going to be safe. And we can develop that.
What should a business leader do in a country where the political leaders are weak or are not offering the type of security and safety that the citizens expect? What would your advice be to that kind of a business leader?
I think my advice would be my advice to any business leader, but especially in a situation like that, that they may not be able to influence the politics and the political leader, but they can influence their own culture. And in that respect, they need to be very clear about what they're expecting from their staff in terms of coming back to work. And they need to consult with their staff in terms of what is going to be safe. And I have some detailed suggestions for that. But having a clear, strong leader, in military terms, it's called commander intent, where if soldiers are under stress and their commander is very clear about what his vision of survival is and how he expects the staff to perform, then the staff feel safe to use their own resilience and resources to meet immediate demands.
What is your expectation from your discussions with your patients and others in terms of what the employees who are now gradually returning to work, what they expect? I mean, do they expect a commander? Do they expect a leader who will consult them on a daily basis? A mixture of both? And what are the signposts? And what should we look for as business leaders to try to prepare well for this situation? I can tell you from our own company, we had the discussion of reopening the office. And the tendency was that people are still safer at home. They feel safer at home. Sometimes because of their own situation, sometimes because of their relatives' situation. They also say, we don't want to risk coming to the office because of our parents or of our friends who may be exposed to the virus. So what signposts do we look for? How do we engage the employees?
I think this is a very important area because a lot of people don't feel safe coming back to work. And then the difficulty in terms of the leader is, what are the problems in getting people back to work? What is it that would make them feel safer? And often it may be something like travel, where they don't want to take public transportation, or they can't get public transportation. And in that case, the company has, or the leader perhaps has to decide if he's going to make it, or she's going to make it easier for the staff to get in by employing cars, by getting people to sign up to travel and to work together. But all of this requires good information flow between employees and their managers, their leaders, the company director. And I think this is an opportunity to strengthen corporate cultures or to strengthen company cultures. Because what's very important is for the manager to be in close contact with staff to find out not only how they're doing, how productive they are, but what their problems are, including what their anxieties are. And on the basis of this, you can begin to address those problems, whether it's actual transportation. I was aware of a factory in Italy that has reopened, and there's social distancing and they're back to work, but there's a problem with the children at home who have no one to look after them. So the children are being left with grandparents who are very vulnerable, and a lot of staff feel very anxious, understandably, about this. And some companies might use this as an opportunity to think, well, maybe we should start a creche for these children. But that's the kind of lateral thinking that is needed at a time like this. But also, it's not just lateral thinking, it's how can we take care of our staff? And how can we develop ways that we haven't done before taking care of our staff?
Great. You mentioned corporate culture. I think the other factor is obviously the national culture. And the question is, well, we know our staff and ourselves are coming back to a new normal with a lot of anxieties. How do we help our employees, our colleagues to open up and talk about their anxieties? Because I think, again, depending on corporate culture and depending on the national culture and also the pre-pandemic relationships, it will be extremely difficult for many to open up and talk about their anxieties. What would your advice be how to open that space, that safe space for staff members?
I'm nodding my head because I have an example of a man whose company, very large international company, during the lockdown set up a meeting, a happy hour, every Friday afternoon. And many companies are doing this. And they all gather together on Zoom and have a drink and just communicate with each other and shoot the breeze, so to speak. And then the leader of this team decided to have another meeting in the middle of the week, at the end of the day, for his staff to talk about the positive things of lockdown. And I heard that this meeting was completely silent. Nobody said a word. And I said to this man, why do you think nobody said anything? And he said, because there aren't many good things about lockdown. All we can think of are the difficult things. And nobody wanted to start talking about this. And it made me think that this is where the gap is, that actually what you need not only is to have a happy hour, but perhaps an unhappy hour, where you can invite your staff to talk about the things that are really difficult in terms of work, primarily, but not exclusively, the things that are really getting to them. The work takes longer, you're more isolated, all kinds of problems. And it's on the basis of having a kind of safe space where there is encouragement to talk about the problems that's actually vital for a strong leadership, because that's where you get your information. That's where you get collaboration with your staff. And that's where you build up loyalty as well. And sometimes the best way of starting kicking the ball is for the leader to say, these are the problems I'm having.
Excellent. We know that the work environment will have to change. I mean, physical changes, social distancing, maybe even dividing the weekdays between home office and office. uh, again, from a psychological perspective, do you think these changes will add to anxieties and will have a negative impact on efficiency and productivity at workplace? Or do you think the respect for the safety and security of employees will actually motivate them? Are there more demotivating factors in there or motivating factors?
I think there are a number of difficulties in taking shifts back to work, for example, and also the social distancing in work, because it's going to be very frustrating and it won't be like it used to be. There will still be better communication with groups, the teams that are at work. But I think that if it's at all possible to arrange some kind of flexibility, that would be best, because people have childcare, they have different other problems at home. They may be working on a project where it's actually easier for them to work at home. So I think the tasks that people are being asked to do also have to be taken into account. It shouldn't just be a blanket, you're in on Tuesday, you're in on Wednesday. And that requires some coordination, of course. But I think the main motivating factor that's important is working together to make sure that people feel safe. And again, going back to this idea that they're being cared for, that they're not just making sacrifices in order to keep the company going, but they're actually being considered, the problems that they're experiencing are being taken on board or certainly acknowledged. And that's crucial if you want people to work together well. The other thing that's very important is, again, I go back to this example of a factory where people are working socially distant. And the only way they can communicate at work is through WhatsApp on the shop floor. And some employers might get very anxious and think that the employees are just wasting time socializing. And I would warn against that, because this communication on the shop floor or on the work floor is absolutely vital, and it's what's been missed. What we've all missed. And it fuels new ideas, it fuels a sense of teamwork. You belong to a whole setting that you feel responsible for. And, if nothing else, you can build in coffee breaks, lunch breaks, another coffee break to make sure that there is this time. One of the things about working from home is that we don't have breaks in between our Zoom meetings, which is entirely unnatural.
True. You mentioned the aspect of trust, both trust between the leader and the colleagues, or also between colleagues. Do you think, again, from a psychological point of view, do we build trust differently when we are in online meetings as opposed to face-to-face meetings? Is something going to be lost as a result of reduction of face-to-face meetings in terms of trusting others?
I think it's a very important question and a very important area. And I think undoubtedly it takes much longer to build up a relationship and to build up trust with someone who you have never had any contact with before, except remotely. I can see the difference with patients that I work with, where I know them very well from personal face-to-face contact, and then it's not so difficult to relate remotely. But if I'm starting with a patient from scratch and we've never met, it takes a much longer time to understand them, and you miss all kinds of cues. So nothing can replace this face-to-face contact. And I think what we're not sensitive to is that we're all very much relying on old relationships. I mean, like us.
Yeah.
You and me.
Yeah, absolutely. This is, to be honest, one of my concerns looking forward, is that it makes a lot of sense to continue these types of online meetings and online interaction. But I think over time, we will lose a number of the, maybe even intangible aspects of interacting. We don't see the body language anymore. We don't see a number of these factors. But let me ask you this again. I learned from Vamik Volkan from a discussion we had about a week ago. He said something very interesting. He said, in this pandemic, we all have lost something. So there is a sense of loss. But in many cases, because it's not one event, it's not one person passing away or one event, and it's something over time. Like he was saying, for him, it was not being able to hug his grandchildren, for example. There is a sense of loss and we don't know what will happen in the future. And his point was that this sense of loss, because we haven't fully processed it, connects us to a lot of previous cases of loss, and we start mourning again, a new process of mourning. How do we deal with that process of mourning, which may be even a bit ambiguous for the colleague and employee and friend himself and herself? How do we try helping them to open up and help them to mourn in this process?
I think that, first of all, as I said in the beginning, we're getting out of the eye of the storm, and in a way, emotionally, the worst period is yet to come. And that will also coincide with an economic depression that I think we will, as large groups, become very depressed. And I think in terms of what we can do in a workplace to help everyone manage their feelings, their depression and their anxiety, is to be able to point these things out. And there are losses within companies. There are people who have died within companies. There are people who are still ill. There are people who have lost jobs in other areas. There are companies that will die out of this, and that has to be openly talked about. It's very, very important.
Thank you, Colin. Any suggestions to leaders in this group how to show that vulnerability, which obviously all of us have, but and does that go with the sort of commander style leadership if you show that you're vulnerable?
Absolutely, because I think that the mistake is to present an image that you can manage everything, because that then transfers down to the troops who feel that they have to manage everything. And then actually you get a lot of misinformation. You get a sort of mirage of what can be done and what's actually being hidden beneath the surface. And in terms of what a leader says, I mean, if a leader may say, I'm finding it difficult to keep in touch with everyone, and I need to, this is very important, and I need your help with that. I mean, that's one example, but there are all kinds where a leader may say, it's taking me, and I think this is quite typical, it's taking me 3 times as long to finish a contract than it would if I were back in the office. And I know this is something everyone's experiencing. I want to just say one other thing about that, because I think that often my idea of the unhappy hour is something that's hived off to HR. And that is, in my view, a terrible mistake, because then managers and leaders don't get the information they need directly. They don't have that communication.
Great. What if you're facing a leader who just wants to push back to go back to pre-pandemic practices and so on? What do you suggest to the employees?
You have to find a way of talking to them and saying, we're all traumatized. This is not going to be the same. And we have to make adjustments, or otherwise no one will come in for work because we can't manage it. It's too difficult. I mean, that may be difficult to say to a leader who is very, very anxious. And what happens, of course, when you're very anxious is that you try and alleviate that anxiety by acting, by making quick decisions that are often disastrous decisions. Sometimes like firing a lot of staff, or I have one example recently that I've heard of a big corporation that has stopped renting their properties, their office properties, on the assumption that everybody can continue to work remotely. And they're saving money to do that. And that's a short-term survival, which is disastrous in the long term, in my view. And I think you have to keep talking and keep putting pressure on the leader. It's difficult.
Excellent. We know that in the post-pandemic time, not just at workplace, but also in society, a number of our social norms are going to change. And in your own assessment, and I know that you also experienced the sort of anxieties and depression that came about after the financial crisis. In your experience, what does that do, the sort of changing social norms, the fact that we have to get used to new realities, new behaviors, and so on? How does that affect motivation at work?
I think it can affect motivation at work very badly because people feel that there's not, especially what's happening now, where our social landscape has changed so much, that there's nothing to look forward to, that everything seems to be going into this recession. The antidote to that is to act as a community, to care for each other, to make people feel that they're not invisible. And I think that's a serious problem. But I think another serious problem, and this was true during the recession, is that this attitude that it will all bounce back. And things will bounce back, but they may not bounce back in the same way. They certainly won't, that we know them. And they may bounce back in a better way, but they also may die on the way. And I think there is this, it's human, it's a kind of denial that there's been any change or that there will be any loss. And that's dangerous because, again, you make bad decisions and you don't see where the pitfalls are. So I think it's psychologically, it's very important and as a trend, and I think we're seeing it politically. And we'll see it, I think, also within industry too, is that because trade supplies, trade chains have been interrupted or delayed, and because there's such fear of this virus infecting, coming from abroad, infecting us, our natural reaction is to isolate ourselves as large groups, not just individually, but large groups, and to be self-sufficient. We don't want to rely on anyone else. We're going to do everything ourselves. You can see this a bit in the competition to produce a vaccine, even though there's a lot of cooperation. There's also a great deal of sense that this is ours. I think most business people will recognize that's disaster. But politically, there's a huge move toward isolationism. And that's something that businesses need to be attuned to and resist.
I agree. We know that during the pandemic, one of the big concerns in every country was whether the country as a whole had the health sector capacity, the sort of medical, both hardware, software capacities to deal with the pandemic. If we agree that there will be a pandemic of anxiety, do you think we have the capacity to deal with that in terms of obviously professional people who deal with these issues, who advise not just companies and individuals, but also maybe large groups, as you said? Do you foresee a bottleneck in terms of managing the pandemic of anxiety?
I'm not sure if there will be a bottleneck, but I think that the problem is that, I was looking through some articles, newspaper articles about managing anxiety. And they all talk about managing individual anxiety. And they have methods like CBT or mindfulness, and they don't address the group. They don't address the culture. And unless you actually address in the whole environment, the community, it's not really going to work. because this is a shared experience. Unlike individual trauma, it's a collective trauma. And I think there aren't many people who know how to help with that. And I think people, because they want to deny that there is a collective trauma, tend to again hive it off and say, oh, well, she's or he's having a bad time, they can go see a therapist. This is more than seeing an individual therapist.
Let me ask you my final question. My final question is, what's your boldest hope for after the pandemic? How can we make business more human and innovative, not just within the company, but also to the outside?
I have a utopian vision of, a small one, of what might happen to a lot of companies. And I'm sure I'm not the only one with this idea at all. But I think because the cities have been so badly hit and feel so frightening, and many people have left cities to go during the lockdown to go to the country, I think that if they can, I think my vision is that perhaps instead of having large office blocks with concentration of people, that there are more hubs outside of cities, more local hubs that will redistribute the work, that can still communicate remotely and face to face as well from time to time, but that there's a rebalancing of how work is actually structured and where it takes place, and less time spent commuting, less anxiety about the healthiness of commuting. All of these things that I imagine could actually now be much easier to do than in the past.
Great. I think the key word is rebalancing, as you said. And I think what's important, what we wanted to communicate to our community today was that in this rebalancing, it would be a mistake to forget about the psychological aspects. So thank you, Coline. Thank you, everyone. It has been a pleasure to do this, and I look forward to future dialogues with all of you, especially with Coline within the International Dialogue Initiative. Thank you.